imagine you're going into a store. And when you're going into the store, you see a store clerk and a security guard. And when you see them, one of them, doesn't matter which, but one of them says hello to you. And when they say hello to you, it comes out sort of like this, like, hey, hello. Is that someone generally trying to seem friendly?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a mind reader. But if I'm walking into a place of business, I would probably think any kind of greeting is, at worst, a courtesy of customer service. I can only imagine, however, where our speaker is going with this.
Yes, some of y'all a little skeptical. I like that. That's okay. Let's say you go into the store a different day. And so on this day, again, you go in, you see a store clerk and a security guard, and one of them says hello to you. Only this time, when they say hello, it comes out sort of like this. Hello. Is that someone trying to seem friendly? No, right?
Right?
Uh-huh. Well, the word seem is the operative term there. I mean, maybe the person is just socially awkward. Maybe you are unfairly judging them. But, okay, for the sake of argument, fine. The second time around didn't sound as genuine. So what?
So what I'm hoping we can get from this exercise is that simple, polite gestures like hello don't always equal friendly. Can we agree on that? And we've all been in a moment or an experience in which what someone said was different than what was being communicated. Does that make sense to everyone?
Oh, are we talking about microaggressions? Those tiny gestures or tones of voice that someone can choose to interpret in a way that helps them to conclude that they are being victimized or discriminated against? Or are we going to go even deeper than all of that?
So when I think about myself as a trans person, I've been out as an adult longer than I've been in the closet, right?
Right?
I also spend a lot of my time talking about identity and talking about transness, and I usually express myself in a way that's outside of typical gender norms. So people are generally rarely surprised to hear me say that I'm trans, even if they don't quite have the language for it. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes perfect sense. You are a unique and brave snowflake, and everyone else has to work to catch up with just how special you really are. Got it.
And so that's not surprising, but what does become surprising for folks is when I say that I grew up in a multi-faith household. In particular, that I have a father who was raised Muslim and a mother who was raised Christian. Now, when I say that, people who perceive themselves as being in solidarity with the part of me that is trans immediately want to focus in on my father. And they want to know, well, what did your father think about you coming out?
Well, the first clue that you gave us about the importance of religion in your family is that you said your parents were both raised within different faiths, not that they were themselves practicing or devout followers of those faiths. Secondly, the fact that two people from different religious backgrounds married one another says that sharing the same faith was not a requirement for their relationship or their marriage, which is another sign that they're not exactly fundamentalists. So both of those clues would support the idea that, if your father did have an issue with your coming out, it was not necessarily based entirely on religious issues. But that's just me listening to what you said and what it implies. Now, I certainly hope that our speaker is not going to use what I can only assume to be the accepting example of his father to try and discredit the real and deadly intolerances within the religion of Islam for people such as himself. Because that would be disingenuous.
And when folks ask me this question, a few things kind of come up. So one, it's clear that they don't think it's important to unpack the relationship I had with my non-Muslim parent. So I noticed that. I noticed the places in which they want me to accept or reject whatever notions they have about who Muslim people are. And I hear the places where they're not actually concerned about the real relationship I had with my father. They're not concerned about the standing breakfast date we had every Saturday morning, in which we would spend 30 days arguing about who got to pay. He got to pay that day, that's why he looked so happy. They're not concerned about the fact that he was my best friend and the person I spent the most time talking about my faith and spiritual journey with. They don't care about the old chain of his that I wear around my neck with his name on it. Nah, they want to hear a critique. How do I know they want to hear a critique? Because when I follow up their question with wonderful stories about the relationship between my father and I after coming out, they are always in shock. But when they're asking this question, they're very polite about it. So should I accept the Islamophobia projected onto my family and my family dynamics simply because the asker is polite about it?
I think our speaker is making complaints over a problem he has made for himself by choosing to live in a world that elevates identity politics over individual merit. So, to his audience, he has only described his parents in terms of their religious upbringing. No one listening could have any other information or idea about them elsewise. And then it was our speaker who chose to take offense to the question about his father's reaction and imbue that question and the questioner with intentions of hatred and intolerance. And only after taking offense to that assumption of intent does our speaker paint his father as anything other than an abstract. Only then does his father become an individual separate from a religious stereotype. Only then does his father become a counterpoint for what our speaker assumes is the opinion of the person asking the question. Because, obviously, the question, "What did your father think?" is not an acknowledgement of the hatred and intolerance in Islam for anyone who deviates from sexual norms written into scripture. No, that question is actually fueled by an irrational fear and hatred of Muslims. Got it.
So, just based off the title, I know for some of y'all, you might have been expecting that this was going to be a coming out story. Well, surprise, I've been out for a long time. And so I'm not invested in dissecting that part of my journey with you. What I do want to talk about is the behavior of others when we live in our truth as trans people, as people of color, and folks from other targeted communities. I really want to talk about politeness. And in particular, I want to talk about the untrustworthiness of polite people. All right, y'all ready for that thought? Y'all ready for that? Because we're going to get into it. Okay?
So, you live in a constant state of suspecting the worst of anyone who is nice to you. That's called paranoid personality disorder. You might want to talk to someone about that.
All right. And so when we think about politeness, right? According to the magical tool that is dictionary.com, politeness is defined as having or showing behaviors that are respectful and or considerate of other people. Having or showing behaviors that are respectful and or considerate of other people. Now, when people hear me talk about my family's upbringing and specifically the religious background, if we're getting to that place in the story, there's a 99.9% chance that they already know my father has passed. And so that they know that they're potentially bringing up a negative experience with a person I love who has died, right?
Right. But seeing as how you have presumably been so very open about your life and family and upbringing by this point in the story, the hesitancy to ask about your father, even if he has passed away, may have understandably decreased. Right?
And so if you could imagine for a second that you have a dying family member, and before consoling you, someone said, "Oh my goodness, that's so sad, but like, did they ever kill anyone?" Or, "Your dead grandma, I totally go, like, did she ever kick a puppy once?" We would think that question is absurd, right? And insensitive, right?
Okay, first, just a note that the audio break a second ago was a part of the original recording. But that aside, by our speaker's own description, he didn't lead with the fact that his father had died. He built up to all of that. And if he had revealed his father's passing in the middle of this tale, most people would likely have expressed their condolences at that point. Like, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." You know, basic politeness. But our speaker is assuming a cold-heartedness in people that isn't necessarily there. He wants people to be curious about him and his various identities, but he doesn't want them to be curious about him in any way he doesn't approve of.
But we would think that question is absurd, right?
Right?
So when someone is asking this question that they are projecting some negative pieces onto my family, are they necessarily being respectful and considerate of me? Right?
Right?
I'm sorry. Who is projecting negativity upon whom? You're the one assuming a question of your father's disposition after you have described your sexual orientation and after you have classified him first and foremost in terms of a homophobic religious doctrine as being a question fueled by insidious hatred. You are the one who is projecting because you are the one assuming intent without evidence.
Are they being respectful and or considerate of my grief? No. They're generally being respectful and or considerate of experiences and stories that they've been told about who trans people and Muslim people are and whether or not they can be the same thing or coexist together.
How would you know what stories anyone asking you about your father might have or might not have been told? How do you know what they are thinking or why they are thinking it merely based on a single question?
They're generally being respectful and or considerate of a system that dehumanizes Muslim people every day and perpetuates Islamophobia. Does that make sense for y'all? Does that make sense?
You know, every time our speaker asks his audience, "Does that make sense?" it almost sounds as though he might as well be asking them, "So, do you admit to your sins?" Regardless, he had to ask that question twice this time. I think the silence the first time around was his answer. But, to reiterate the claim, politeness and respect perpetuate Islamophobia. Got it.
And I'm not totally psychic.
Oh, so you're only partially psychic?
But I'm sensing that not everyone is quite there with me on the politeness piece yet, especially if you do not come from targeted communities that get interrogated at the same level that people like myself and other folks often are every day about who we are and our experiences. It might be hard to measure the harm that is caused from that kind of framework. So I'm going to give you all a better story, right?
Right?
A more clear story. Y'all ready for that?
Translation: You cannot possibly understand where I am coming from because I am a special, complex, and elevated victim, and the rest of you are safe and entitled in your inherent privilege. Now, let me explain to you my tale of woe and why I require your sympathy and require that you feel guilty. Got it.
Okay, so we're going to travel back in time to a few years ago. So a few years ago, I was volunteering at a summer camp. This summer camp was 70% white, and it was happening on a college campus. Okay, and so one day in particular, there's an event happening outside or inside of a building on campus, and myself and 3 other black folks were standing outside the building having a conversation about some things that came up in the day, and so everybody else is inside. And so within 10 to 12 minutes of us being outside, 3 white police officers rush up toward us with their hands on their weapons, okay? Not yet drawn, but making sure that we're clear that they have them, okay? And so one of the police officers that I'm perceiving to be in charge is looking at us in his about 40s or 50s and says, "We got a noise complaint. It was hard to find you," right?
Right?
And so this presents a cognitive dissonance, right?
Right?
Not necessarily. The directions they were given to the location of the complaint might have been unclear. They were responding to the complaint, after all. They were not the ones who made the complaint.
So how can it be that we are both so loud that we require police intervention, yet so quiet that it's hard to find us?
Well, why don't you ask the person who made the complaint?
Is anyone here an anxious giggler? Anyone anxious giggler? Raise your hand if you're an anxious giggler, right?
Right?
That's something that I do. Is that the greatest response to stress? No. Is it a human response to stress? Yeah. So in this moment, lots of things are bubbling up for me, especially as I'm seeing this juxtaposition of us as four black folks standing outside in proximity to these white police officers that are cornering us simply because of a perceived noise complaint or noise violation.
But not perceived by the officers, responded to by the officers. And it sounds like you were the one focusing on race in this situation. Oh, but I forgot. You're partially psychic. My mistake.
And so as I'm getting more anxious, the first thing I can think to say out of my mouth is, well, of course you got a noise complaint. There's 4 black people standing outside.
That's what you said to the police. Got it.
And so the police officer in that moment, he doesn't just get angry. He becomes anger.
Become vengeance, David.
Right?
Right?
He becomes anger.
Become wrath.
And so as he's shouting and things are getting really real,
He was shouting. What was he shouting? Why was he shouting? Why does your recitation of events suddenly become so vague?
my spirit is kind of floating above my body, and I'm imagining all the different things and scenarios that can happen in this moment.
You are imagining things. Got it.
And as that is happening, my friend, who is a Virgo and thinks a lot more about what she says before she says it, starts de-escalating the situation, which is something she shouldn't have to know how to do, but she does it very well in that situation.
You mouth off to a police officer, and your friend tries to de-escalate things. Wow, you were really lucky to have that friend there to try and cover for you.
And so eventually, the police officers leave, and we go back inside, and now we are tasked with explaining to a mostly white group of people what just happened to us.
You're tasked. Tasked by whom? And why is the race of the other people there relevant? And what did happen? The cops arrived, you exchanged a few words, and they left. The situation only escalated after you decided to be a smartass. Wow, what a burden you had to bear in relaying that story.
And so as we're talking to people, a lot of people start crying.
What? Crying?
There's no crying in baseball!
Crying. Got it.
And hugging us and telling us, oh my goodness, I can't believe that happened to you. I'm so sorry that happened to you.
But nothing happened to you.
Which is another paradox, right?
Right?
Because here we were in this moment, and were we allowed to cry? No, the littlest bit of anxiety that I showed got reined in really quick by the police.
Well, wait. What? After the police had left, after you were indoors and telling everyone this story, the police were disallowing you from crying. What?
And so camp ends. A few months later, it's time to plan for the next camp. And so at the time, the executive director is being very evasive about where the next camp is going to be. And it gets to this kind of a critical mass point where you kind of got to know where things are happening or camp can't happen. And so eventually the executive director reveals, well, actually, we're going to have camp the same exact place we had it last year. So meaning the place that we just got held up, right?
Right?
Held up. You briefly encountered the police, who were responding to a noise complaint, to whom you talked back to, and you say you were shouted at, but you won't tell us why or what was shouted at you, and then the police left. And that entire scenario qualifies to you as being held up. Got it.
And so why was that? So the executive director, who is white,
And his race is relevant to this story because he's a racist, I assume?
called up the police departments as well as the campus staff and said, well, everyone apologized, which is inaccurate because they did not apologize to the people that actually experienced the trauma. They apologized to a leadership team.
Experienced the trauma. What trauma? Nothing happened to you.
And they were very polite and they were nice. And the campus even gave us a discount to return. Right?
Right?
So when those of us that experienced that profiling incident pushed back, we were told that we were being irrational. We were being divisive. We were being mean. Right?
Right?
Profiling incident. When was the profiling exactly? You've offered nothing to suggest the police approached you because you were black. The only thing that you have quoted them as saying is that they were responding to a noise complaint, and you then inferred that them having said it was hard to find the place meant that they were somehow being dishonest. You've described nothing insidious or untoward on the part of the police or the camp administrators. Barring further details, yes, you were being irrational and divisive and mean.
And as a result of the fallout of that, none of us that actually experienced that racial profiling incident are part of that organization anymore. Right?
Right?
So what was the function of politeness in that moment?
The function? Well, the function was an attempt to placate your paranoia and your hurt feelings. The function was to de-escalate a nothing event that you turned into a racially motivated hate crime, and them bending over backwards to try and make peace. That was the function.
Politeness served three major functions. One, it allowed the leadership team to keep their business contacts happy, right?
Right?
Because there was no consequences for anyone, right?
Right?
Two, it became a financial endeavor, right?
Right?
And there was a financial benefit. They actually traded our racial profiling incident in for a discount, right?
Right?
Thirdly, whether intentional or unintentional, it served to weed out parts of community that were targeted communities as part of that organization. Does that make sense?
No, it doesn't make sense. And each time you ask your audience for affirmation, it really does nothing to bolster your argument. But that aside, you and your friends chose not to participate in the camp anymore. You and your friends chose not to accept the apologies and gestures of goodwill that were offered to you. So, in the case of this tale of woe, your pain is self-chosen.
And that's something that many organizations deal with, that they're always wondering, oh my goodness, why is there such a high overturn of this XYZ population as part of the organization? Well, when stuff happened that showed people they were unsafe, was the organization invested in politeness or justice? Y'all understand that?
Do I understand that? Politeness or justice? I wonder what would have constituted justice to our speaker in this case. I wonder what assumptions of intent he would have wanted to have permanently branded on the records of the police officers and the camp administrators. I wonder if anything would ever be enough to make our speaker happy in his quest for justice.
So in that moment, if that is what politeness looks like on the ground, what is the ask of justice? So what is the ask of justice?
Yes, what is the ask of justice? I am very, very curious to know.
So if we move closer to justice, and actually, I want you to raise your hand if you if you would answer yes to the next question I'm going to ask you. Have you ever had a conversation in which someone kept doing something that caused you harm but said they were trying to help you? Have you ever had a conversation in which someone kept doing something that caused you harm but said they were trying to help you? Raise your hand if you've experienced that. Okay. And so you want to hear something that's going to make you feel real queasy? You want to hear something?
Do I have a choice?
You've been that person to somebody else. And to many somebody else's, especially if your approach to justice is to focus on the ways you can't possibly be invested in white supremacy, that you can't possibly be transphobic, that you can't possibly be Islamophobic or xenophobic or ableist. Does that make sense for y'all? Right?
Right?
Anyone who does not think they operate on hate or discrimination is totally operating on hate and discrimination and are white supremacists. That is what I am to make sense of. No. No, it doesn't make sense.
So we have to own our role in a framework that prioritizes politeness over justice. Why? Because there have been some goodies that you have been getting in exchange for your niceties. There have been goodies that you have been getting in exchange for your niceties, and we must be honest with that in order to move forward. So that means, for white folks in the room, what sort of goodies do you get in exchange for your politeness and niceties in the face of trauma against black and brown people?
Well, I don't know. Why don't you educate me on the race-centric advantages of good manners?
Is it keeping a certain type of job? Is it having a bank account that looks a certain type of way? Is it getting the promotion on time? Is it being seen as the nice person who is friends with quote-unquote everybody? Right?
Right?
I got my job because I pursued it. I have the money I have because I saved it. And I am a YouTuber, so trust me, there is a large swath of the population who does not think that I am a nice guy. But I am a nice guy. And because I think that I am a nice guy, that actually means I am not a nice guy, because our speaker's logic is the one true reflection of reality. Got it.
What are the goodies you're getting? Cisgender folks, what sort of goodies do you get for being polite and nice in the face of trauma that happens to trans people? Right?
Right?
So, is it that you get to be quirky but not as weird as these people over here? Is it again that you get to laugh at that joke without a conscience, right?
Right?
Is it that cis people get to be accused of hateful thoughts and motivations and are assumed to be insensitive and arrogant towards other people? Is it that cis people get to be a demographic that our speaker is allowed to hate openly and freely and be praised for doing so? Would those be goodies that our speaker enjoys as a queer, black, transgender man, I wonder? Or would there also be goodies like being a blogger at the Huffington Post? Or appearing on MSNBC? Or appearing on Essence? Or having his work show up in BuzzFeed, and The Root, and the New York Times? Would all of those be goodies attained by our speaker, primarily on the basis of his race, gender, and orientation by any chance?
What are the goodies? For non-Muslim people, is it a false sense of safety? What are the goodies you're getting? Does that make sense?
No. No, it doesn't make sense. But I do believe that it makes sense to you. I believe that you truly envision the worst in people who are not like you, who do not look like you do, or live like you do. I am convinced that all you see around you are condescending, hateful racists who are all passively conspiring to do you harm and make you feel traumatized. And I truly believe that if you choose to disparage any gesture of kindness you receive as an insult, vindicating your sense of inherent victimhood, then you will always be a victim in this bizarre world where being a victim is the greatest badge of honor one can possess. But, then again, I am white, and cis, and a non-Muslim, so I should just keep silent. That would be, after all, the polite thing to do. As always, thank you for watching.